Gang targets Steven Seagal at his roadside diner, unaware he's a former Marine. The roadside diner had seen better days. Faded paint. A flickering neon sign. The smell of coffee that never really left the air. It was the kind of place travelers stopped at when the highway felt endless and quiet felt safer than crowds. Inside, a man calmly wiped the counter, moving with slow, deliberate motions. No rush. No stress. Just focus. To anyone watching, he looked like an ordinary diner owner. Older jacket, rolled-up sleeves, eyes that seemed distant but alert. That man was Steven Seagal. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles shattered the silence. 5 of them pulled up at once. Engines growled. Boots hit the pavement. Laughter followed, loud, careless, full of confidence. This wasn't a friendly stop for food. This was a hunt. The gang leader pushed the diner door open so hard it slammed against the wall. The bell rang once, sharp and nervous. Every customer inside froze. Forks stopped mid-air. Coffee cups trembled. The leader scanned the room like a predator choosing prey. "Well, well," he said, grinning. "Looks like we found ourselves a quiet little gold mine." One gang member laughed. Another cracked his knuckles. A third blocked the door. Steven didn't move. He slowly placed the cloth down, lifted his eyes, and met the leader's stare. Calm. Unbothered. Almost curious. "You serving food," the leader sneered, "or you serving trouble?" Steven's voice was steady. "We're closing soon. You can eat, or you can leave." That answer shocked them. They expected fear. They expected shaking hands. They expected excuses. Instead, they got calm resistance. The gang laughed harder now. "Did you hear that?" one of them said. "This old guy's got courage." Another leaned close to a frightened customer. "Guess tonight's our lucky night." Steven took a slow breath. He glanced around the diner, at the families, the truck driver, the young waitress frozen near the register. Something in his expression changed. Not anger. Not panic. Decision. The leader stepped closer, pointing a finger at Steven's chest. "Listen carefully, old man. We own places like this. And if you don't cooperate—" Steven interrupted him quietly. "You've got 10 seconds to walk out." The laughter stopped. The room went still. No one in that diner knew it yet, but the gang had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. And they were standing face to face with a man who had survived things far worse than them. The diner returned to a strange, uneasy rhythm after the gang's laughter faded into silence. The bell above the door swayed slightly, still ringing in the air like a warning. Outside, the motorcycles idled, engines humming low, patient, threatening. Steven stood behind the counter, hands resting flat on the worn surface. He could feel the tension in the room, heavy and electric. Every eye shifted between him and the men now spreading out across the diner like they owned it. The leader took his time, strolling toward a booth, dragging a chair loudly across the floor before sitting down without invitation. "Relax," he said mockingly. "We're just here to talk business." One gang member leaned against the jukebox, pressing random buttons. Music blasted briefly before he cut it off with a laugh. Another flipped a salt shaker into his hand and caught it, over and over, watching the waitress flinch each time. Steven noticed everything. He noticed how the exits were blocked. He noticed the spacing between the men. He noticed who was nervous, and who was reckless. Years ago, in another life, those details had meant survival. The leader tapped the table. "This diner's in a perfect spot. Middle of nowhere. No witnesses who matter." He smiled. "Which means protection isn't cheap." Steven walked out from behind the counter slowly, carefully, as if he were just an aging owner stretching his legs. He refilled a coffee cup at a nearby table, nodding politely to the truck driver whose hands were shaking. "Everything's fine," Steven said quietly to him. "Finish your coffee." The leader watched closely now. His grin faded just a little. "You don't look scared," he said. Steven met his eyes. "Fear makes people sloppy." That line landed heavier than Steven intended. The gang member by the jukebox frowned. The waitress whispered, "Sir, please just give them what they want." Steven shook his head once. Not how this works. The leader stood up suddenly, slamming both hands on the table. Plates rattled. Wrong answer. One of the gang members kicked over an empty chair. Another pulled out a knife, spinning it lazily between his fingers, the metal catching the diner lights. Stephen's gaze locked onto the blade, not with panic, but with calculation. Funny thing about knives, Stephen said. People think they give power. They mostly give confidence to people who lack control. The man with the knife sneered and stepped forward. You talk too much. Stephen took a slow step back, positioning himself so the counter was no longer behind him. He shifted slightly, subtle, almost invisible to anyone untrained. The leader noticed. What are you? He asked. Some kind of wannabe tough guy? Stephen didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the clock on the wall. 9 minutes past 8. Outside, a truck roared by on the highway. Inside, the tension tightened. The gang had come expecting an easy payday. An old man. A scared crowd. A quick show of force. What they found instead was someone who didn't raise his voice, didn't back down, and didn't blink when threatened. The leader stepped closer, invading Stephen's space. You know what happens to places that don't pay, he whispered. They burn. Stephen's voice dropped even lower. You're already standing in a place built on discipline. You just don't recognize it. The leader laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. He turned to his men. Teach the owner a lesson. Not too rough. Just enough to make him remember who's in charge. The gang moved in. Stephen closed his eyes for a brief second, not in fear, but in memory. Training. Commands. Cold mornings. Long nights. When he opened them, his posture had changed. The calm was still there, but now it was focused. And every instinct in his body was awake. The waitress held her breath. The customers braced themselves. The gang took one final step forward. None of them realized they had just crossed the line. The moment the gang stepped forward, the air inside the diner changed. It wasn't louder. It wasn't chaotic. It was focused. Stephen felt it instantly, the same tightening in the chest, the same quiet alertness he hadn't felt in years. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing slowed, and his feet adjusted almost on their own. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing. To someone trained, it meant everything. The man with the knife lunged first. Not fast. Not clean. Just angry. Stephen shifted to the side, letting the blade pass where his chest had been a second earlier. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisted gently, but precisely, and the knife clattered to the floor. Before the man could react, Stephen guided him forward into the counter. Hard. Controlled. The man dropped, gasping, more shocked than hurt. The room erupted. Chairs scraped. Someone shouted. A customer screamed. 2 gang members rushed him at once. Stephen didn't rush back. He stepped into them. One punch came wild and high. Stephen blocked it with his forearm, pivoted, and used the attacker's momentum to send him crashing into a booth. The second grabbed Stephen from behind, arms wrapping tight. Bad idea. Stephen lowered his center of gravity, hooked a leg, and rolled. The attacker hit the floor with a thud that knocked the breath from his lungs. Stephen was already on his feet. The leader backed up a step. What the hell? He muttered. The gang had expected fear. Resistance, maybe. But not this. Not efficiency. Not calm. Another gang member swung a chair. Stephen caught it midair, wrenched it free, and tossed it aside like it weighed nothing. The man froze, suddenly unsure. Stay down, Stephen said quietly to the ones already on the floor. They didn't argue. The leader's face twisted with rage and disbelief. He grabbed a bottle from a table and smashed it, holding the jagged edge forward. You think you're special? He snarled. You think you scare me? Stephen didn't answer. He glanced quickly around the diner. Customers huddled near the walls, the waitress crouched behind the register, hands over her mouth. No one else would get hurt. Not tonight. The leader charged. This one was faster. Meaner. Desperate. Stephen moved inside the swing, taking a shallow cut across his sleeve but avoiding the edge. He trapped the leader's arm, twisted, and drove a short strike into his shoulder. The bottle fell. Stephen kicked it away. The leader stumbled back, clutching his arm. "Who are you?" he shouted. Stephen stood still now. Completely still. "A man who asked you to leave," he replied. The remaining gang member hesitated. His confidence cracked. He looked at his friends, one groaning near the counter, another slumped in the booth, another curled on the floor trying to breathe. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a lesson. Outside, one of the motorcycles revved nervously, as if the rider sensed something had gone wrong. Inside, the leader took a step back toward the door. "This isn't over," he said, trying to sound threatening. "You messed with the wrong people." Stephen's eyes locked onto his. "No," he said. "You did." The leader turned to run. That's when the sound of sirens cut through the night. Faint at first, then closer. The gang froze. Stephen hadn't called them, not yet, but someone in the diner had. The waitress, shaking but brave, had pressed the button beneath the counter when the first punch was thrown. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. The leader cursed under his breath. Police cars screeched to a stop outside. Doors slammed. Commands were shouted. The gang dropped to the floor. Hands up. Faces down. All bravado gone. Stephen stepped back, raising his hands calmly as officers rushed in. "Everyone okay?" an officer shouted. Stephen nodded. "They are now." The officer looked at the scene, overturned chairs, stunned gang members, terrified customers, and then back at Stephen. "You handle yourself pretty well," he said cautiously. Stephen offered a small, tired smile. "Old habits." As the gang was cuffed and dragged outside, the leader twisted his head back. "You're not just some diner owner," he spat. Stephen met his eyes one last time. "No," he said. "I'm not." The diner slowly exhaled. But the story wasn't over yet. Because once the police learned who Steven Seagal really was, and what he used to be, the night would take an even bigger turn. The diner felt different once the gang was gone. The sirens faded into the distance, taking the chaos with them, but the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Chairs lay overturned. A cracked plate rested near the counter. Coffee spilled slowly across the floor, untouched. Stephen stood quietly near the register, one hand resting on the counter, breathing steady. His jacket sleeve was torn, a thin line of blood visible, but he didn't seem to notice. The customers did. They stared at him, not with fear now, but disbelief. A truck driver finally broke the silence. "Son, you didn't move like a regular guy." Stephen gave a small nod. "Neither did they." The waitress stepped out from behind the counter, eyes wide, voice shaking. I thought they were going to kill someone." "They weren't," Stephen said gently. "They wanted control. That usually disappears once it's challenged." She looked at him like she wanted to ask more questions, but didn't. Two police officers re-entered the diner after securing the scene. One was young, clearly new. The other older, with eyes that missed nothing. The older officer studied Stephen closely. "Mind telling me your name, sir?" "Stephen," he replied. "Stephen Seagal." The officer paused. Not because of fame. Because of recognition. He tilted his head slightly, looking at Stephen's stance, his hands, the way he carried himself even now. "Where did you learn to handle yourself like that?" the officer asked. Stephen hesitated for half a second. "Service," he said. The word landed quietly, but heavily. The younger officer glanced at his partner. "Service." The older officer nodded slowly. "Military." Stephen met his eyes. "A long time ago." That was enough. The officer straightened his posture instinctively, his tone shifting from authority to respect. "Former Marine." Stephen didn't correct him. He didn't confirm it either. He simply said, "I don't like trouble. But I don't run from it." The officer exhaled. "Neither do Marines." As statements were taken, customers slowly regained their voices. Whispers spread from booth to booth. "That guy dropped 3 men like nothing. Did you see how calm he was? He warned them." One man pulled out his phone and quietly rewound a shaky video he'd recorded. His eyes widened. "This is going everywhere." Stephen noticed and gently shook his head. Please don't. The man hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. You're right. The police escorted the gang members out one by one. Their confidence was gone. Their heads stayed low. The leader glanced back once more, anger replaced by something closer to fear. Stephen didn't look back. Once the officers finished, the older one returned. We'll keep patrols passing through for a while, he said. You should consider closing early tonight. Stephen looked around his diner, the cracked floor, the scared faces, the mess. Then he shook his head. People still need food. And a place that feels safe. The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. You've already done more than most. As the police left, the customers slowly returned to their seats. Someone helped stack chairs. Another grabbed a mop. No one was asked. They just did it. The diner wasn't just a building anymore. It was a shared moment. The waitress brought Stephen a clean cloth for his sleeve. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. You could have just given them the money. Stephen tied the cloth around his arm. Then they'd come back. Stronger. Meaner. She swallowed. Aren't you afraid they'll come after you now? Stephen looked out the window at the empty highway, the neon sign buzzing softly above it. I've been through worse, he said. And I'm still here. The clock ticked on. Coffee was poured again. Plates were served. The diner slowly returned to life, but no one forgot what they had witnessed. Because tonight, they didn't just see violence. They saw discipline. They saw control. They saw a quiet man stand firm when fear tried to take over. And somewhere deep down, every person in that diner understood one thing clearly. That calm man behind the counter was carrying a past forged in places far more dangerous than a roadside diner. And this night was only the beginning of the truth coming out. Morning light crept slowly across the highway, washing the diner in pale gold. The neon sign finally flickered off, replaced by sunlight and the quiet hum of passing trucks. The chaos of the night before felt unreal now, like a bad dream that refused to fade. Stephen stood outside the diner, sipping black coffee, watching the road. He hadn't slept. Not because of pain or fear, but because old memories had a way of resurfacing after nights like this. Inside, a police cruiser rolled back into the lot. 2 vehicles this time. The older officer from the night before stepped out, followed by a man in a dark suit. No uniform. No badge on display. Just confidence. Stephen noticed immediately. The officer approached. Morning, Stephen. Sorry to bother you again. No bother, Stephen replied calmly. The man in the suit studied him carefully, head to toe. The stance. The stillness. The eyes that never stopped scanning. You left some details out last night, the man said. Stephen took another sip of coffee. Didn't seem necessary. The officer cleared his throat. This is Agent Harris. Federal. The word shifted the air. Customers inside the diner fell quiet, peeking through the windows. Agent Harris spoke again. The gang you stopped last night isn't local. Extortion, trafficking, armed assaults. We've been tracking them for months. Stephen nodded once. They're sloppy. Harris raised an eyebrow. Sloppy men don't usually get neutralized without shots fired. Not by one person. Stephen met his gaze. They underestimated the situation. Harris folded his arms. No. They underestimated you. There was a pause. You didn't just disarm them, Harris continued. You controlled them. Spacing. Timing. Pressure points. That's not bar fight instinct. Stephen exhaled slowly. I told you. Service. Harris stepped closer, lowering his voice. Force recon. The officer stiffened. Stephen didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the highway again. Long, empty, stretching into nowhere. Long time ago, he said finally. Different life. That was confirmation enough. Harris nodded slowly, respect clear on his face now. Figures. We ran your name after last night. Didn't expect it to match. Most people don't, Stephen replied. Inside the diner, whispers spread like wildfire. Federal agent. Marine. That explains everything. The waitress stepped outside hesitantly. Sir, is everything okay? Harris smiled politely. Everything's fine. You're safe. Stephen turned to her. You did good last night. Her eyes filled with tears. I was terrified. You still acted, Stephen said. That matters. Harris glanced back toward the road. The gang leader's talking. Says he picked this diner because it looked easy. Said you looked ordinary. Stephen allowed himself a faint smile. Ordinary keeps you alive. Harris extended a card. If anything happens, anything at all, you call me. Stephen took it, nodding. Appreciate it. As the agents drove off, the diner slowly filled again. Travelers. Locals. Curious faces. Someone recognized him. Not from movies. Not from fame. From the way he stood. A middle-aged man approached cautiously. You were military, weren't you? Stephen looked at him. Once. The man nodded deeply. I was too. Army. Afghanistan. Stephen extended his hand. Glad you made it back. They shook hands, not as strangers, but as survivors. Word spread quickly that day. Not online, by mouth. Truckers told other truckers. Locals told their families. The diner wasn't the easy place anymore. It was the place where a gang got stopped cold. That afternoon, Stephen replaced the broken chair. Fixed the counter. Cleaned the floor himself. No drama. No interviews. Just work. As the sun dipped again, the waitress looked around the full diner. You know, they won't come back. Stephen wiped the counter. Bullies rarely do once exposed. She smiled. You're not afraid anymore? Stephen paused. I never was, he said. Fear just learned to stay quiet. Outside, the highway stretched on, unchanged. Inside, something had shifted forever. Because the truth was out now. The calm diner owner wasn't just a man avoiding trouble. He was a man who had already survived war. And when danger came looking for him, it found discipline, restraint, and a past it couldn't touch. The diner settled into a new rhythm after the truth came out. Not louder. Not flashier. Just steadier. For the first time in years, Stephen noticed patrol cars passing the highway more often. Not hovering, just present. A quiet signal that the night before hadn't been forgotten. Inside, customers came and went with a different kind of energy. They spoke softer. They smiled more. They lingered longer over coffee, as if the diner itself had become a place of reassurance. Stephen didn't change his routine. He still opened early. Still cleaned his own tables. Still cooked like nothing extraordinary had happened. But people watched him differently now. A young trucker approached the counter one afternoon, hesitating. Sir, my brother's getting bullied back home. What do you do when walking away doesn't work? Stephen slid him a coffee. You stand your ground once. Calmly. Clearly. And only as much as needed. The trucker nodded, absorbing every word. Another day, an elderly woman left extra cash on the table. For fixing the chairs, she said. And for keeping us safe. Stephen tried to refuse. She insisted. You reminded us what courage looks like, she said. That word again. Courage. Stephen never claimed it. He knew courage wasn't about fighting, it was about restraint. One evening, just before sunset, the older police officer returned alone. No lights. No urgency. I wanted to let you know, he said, leaning against the counter, the gang's operation got shut down. Your stand helped connect a lot of dots. Stephen nodded. Glad no one else gets hurt. The officer studied him for a moment. You ever miss it? The uniform. Stephen wiped his hands with a towel. I miss the clarity. Right and wrong were simpler back then. And now? Now, Stephen said, glancing at the diner, I protect things that matter in quieter ways. The officer smiled. You did good, Stephen. As night fell, a group of bikers pulled into the lot. Engines roared. Boots hit the pavement. The diner went silent. Stephen noticed immediately, but didn't tense. He just kept pouring coffee. The door opened. 3 bikers walked in. Not loud. Not aggressive. One raised his hands slowly. Easy. We're not them. Stephen met his eyes. Didn't think you were. They ordered food. Paid. Left a generous tip. When they left, the room exhaled again. The waitress laughed nervously. Guess word travels fast. Stephen nodded. So does respect. Later that night, as the last customer left, Stephen locked the door and sat alone at the counter. The diner hummed softly, lights warm and steady. He took out the federal agent's card, turned it once in his hand, then placed it back in the drawer. That chapter was closed. Outside, the highway whispered past, cars rushing to places that mattered to them. Stephen cleaned the counter one last time and looked around. The diner wasn't just a business anymore. It was a reminder. That strength doesn't announce itself. That discipline doesn't seek attention. That the past can protect the present, if you let it. Tomorrow would be another quiet day. More coffee. More strangers. More stories passing through. And if danger ever came again, it wouldn't find a victim. It would find a man who knew exactly who he was, what he stood for, and how to stop things without becoming what he fought against. Stephen turned off the lights. The diner went dark. But the lesson stayed lit. Weeks passed, but the story of that night never really left the highway. It traveled quietly, from truck stop to truck stop, from late-night coffee counters to early-morning gas stations. Not as gossip, not as exaggeration, but as a reminder. A reminder that strength doesn't always look the way people expect it to. The roadside diner remained exactly the same. Same flickering sign. Same worn counter. Same calm man behind it. Stephen never put up signs. Never told the story. Never corrected rumors. Some said he was a war hero. Others said he was special forces. Stephen let the stories float by like passing headlights. Because the truth didn't need defending. One evening, a young boy stopped outside the diner with his father. The boy stared through the window, wide-eyed. "That's him," the boy whispered. The father nodded. "The man who stood up to them." The boy thought for a moment. "He doesn't look scary." The father smiled. "Exactly." Inside, Stephen overheard and said nothing. He poured coffee, wiped the counter, and nodded politely as they walked in. Later that night, the waitress approached him. "Do you ever think about leaving? Going somewhere quieter?" Stephen looked around. "This is quiet." She laughed softly. "You know what I mean." He paused. "I spent years in places where quiet meant something bad was about to happen. This kind of quiet, I earned it." She nodded, understanding more than words could explain. As closing time neared, Stephen stepped outside. The sky was clear, stars scattered across it like distant fires. He breathed in the cool air, feeling something rare. Peace. He thought about the gang leader, how confidence had crumbled into fear the moment control slipped away. Not because of violence, but because of discipline. That was the lesson. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't boast. It doesn't threaten. It waits. The diner lights glowed behind him, welcoming the next traveler, the next tired soul looking for warmth and safety. Stephen went back inside and locked the door. Before turning off the lights, he paused, looking at the empty booths. People assume strength means domination. That respect is taken by force. But the truth is simpler and harder. Respect is earned by how you treat people when you don't have to be kind. Strength is proven by how much force you choose not to use. That night at the diner wasn't about fighting a gang. It was about drawing a line. A line that said, "You don't get to terrorize the weak. You don't get to rule through fear. You don't get to walk into someone's peace and take it." Stephen turned off the last light. The diner fell into darkness, resting until morning. And somewhere down the road, men who once believed power came from intimidation now carried the memory of a quiet man who didn't raise his voice, but never stepped back. That memory would follow them far longer than bruises ever could. Because humility is the mark of the truly strong. Calm is the weapon of the disciplined. And silence often carries the loudest warning of all. Type respect in the comments if you believe real strength doesn't need to shout. And tell me, where are you watching from? Salute to everyone who stands firm with dignity, patience, and honor.